Teachers, what are some signs that a student is being mistreated or lives in a toxic environment? It's been a few years, but I had an incident, a situation that stuck with me. My students were working on something, probably solving density equations, and one guy came up to ask for help. I was standing near my whiteboard but had left my favorite expo marker on the cart that held my projector and laptop. So I reached around him to grab the marker and show him on the board how to figure out the problem. Hey, if one kid is struggling with a problem, there's usually several more that haven't asked. Anyway, when I reached, he flinched, hard, arms over his head, eyes tight shut, as if he just knew I was going to hurt him. I kept him after class and we talked. Lots of tears, not just his. He showed me bruises on his back. I notified my principal that I need someone to cover my next class and called DCS, what most states call CPS. He was placed in a foster home and his father was arrested. He missed a few days and came back. He wasn't instantly better, which would make for a better story, but by the end of the school year, I could see he was a little more confident, a little happier. This was around 10 years ago. I often wonder what happened to him. I guess you could say that was a marking moment in your career, but seriously, it's a really touching story. Story 2. Physical cruelty. Think of kids who get normal bumps and scrapes. Then think of areas that would be difficult. Also, if you ask a child, "Oh, how did you get that bruise? It looks sore." Usually they'll tell you some huge story about how they were playing some game with their siblings, and they tried to do X and then fell and did this, etc. Mistreated children will try to shut down the conversation, say it's not sore, doesn't hurt, not that bad, was an accident. You won't find out how it happened. Mistreated children know that whatever has been done to them is bad. It may be a one-off, it may be repeated. Do they suddenly know words you've not taught them in context? Are they regressing and toileting, nighttime or daytime wetting, etc.? Do they have an aversion to a place, a person, or a certain day? Perhaps on Tuesdays they go to a friend's house, so they only display this behavior sometimes. As parents do, they suddenly hate a place they used to love. Cruel people will try to get children to trust them, to want to be praised by them. As a parent, you're wondering why they don't want to do this with you. Sleeping patterns may change, especially if they don't feel safe at all times when they should have a place they can relax. Children can become very controlling of their bodies. Please, early on, ensure children know boundaries. Not all mistreatment is the same. Not all mistreatment is done by adults. It can be older children and teenagers. I've worked in nurseries, after-school clubs, schools, summer camps. I've been a sports coach, a babysitter, a private tutor, a teaching assistant in schools. I've spent days with social work and police and now work in healthcare. You'll spot signs everywhere. You may be a member of the public walking in a store and see something that worries you. As many people are saying in the comments, you might be the trusted friend hearing about a child in potential risk. Know how to report concerns, who you tell, and how you escalate something. Know how to listen to a child without prompting and how to record the conversation on paper in case your statement is used to build a case. Also, knowing that reporting concerns doesn't mean someone will immediately be arrested on your thoughts. A case has to be investigated. Social work and child protective services and police, they'll conduct joint investigations to determine if there is enough evidence to proceed. Story 3. It's pretty obvious, but I had a kid come in with a black eye. I didn't think anything of it at first. He was a very active child with a lot of energy. So I nonchalantly asked what happened. He instantly responded with, "I ran into a door." And the way he said it, it was so quick and forced that it sounded rehearsed. Any teacher is required to report suspicion, even if it may be nothing. Turns out his moms were the worst kind of evil. Regularly harm him, made him sit in a closet for hours if he acted out, forced him to stand for hours holding water buckets, and if he stumbled, they'd hit him more. Believe it or not, his baby sister, about 3, had it worse. Now that I'm looking back on it, I realized something was wrong because she was so developmentally delayed when it came to speech. Thankfully, the pieces of trash that called themselves parents were arrested, and both children went on to live with their grandmother, but it's disgusting what happened to them. Anyway, answer to the question, unexplained bruises, rehearsed lines trying to explain them away. Sometimes developmental delays in speech, drawings, not always, but sometimes kids express what they can't say through drawing. The biological father left the children, and the biological mother later married a woman. This is one instance originating from a same-gender couple, but that in no way indicates that same-gender couples are inherently bad parents, nor does it mean they should not have children. I'm no longer their teacher and haven't seen them in around 4 years. The last I heard, they were doing well. Grandmother isn't perfect, but they're safe and cared for. Yeah, it's a shame that such a beautiful thing like parenthood can be so twisted. I hope those kids can heal from this trauma. Story 4. Not exactly a teacher, but a former daycare and after-school care worker here. I had a child for years who came in clothes that were too old or too small. Her shoes would be falling apart, and she'd often ask us for tape to put them back together. I was always suspicious of this, but the other staff would just say, "Oh, they don't have money." So I tried to let it slide, even though I knew it wasn't really true and that clothes for a 12-year-old are not that expensive, especially when we had lots of discount shops around. She would also come in smelling badly or her hair being greasy. After subtly talking about it and her telling me she just didn't like to shower, I found she wasn't allowed to shower often. As a child going through puberty, this was unacceptable to me, but again, the other staff brushed off my concerns. One day, she started talking about the bugs in her room, and I felt my intuition growing stronger about the situation. This was a clear case of neglect. There were little things here and there that made me suspicious as well, like stories of her grandfather stealing money from her and other little signs of it. After being concerned for a long time, the thing that broke it all for me was hearing how she was given cold, moldy food for lunch. I called DCF that night. A week later, she started coming in smelling fresh and wearing new clean clothes and new shoes. I can't say what else changed at home, but seeing her confidence rise when she was finally clean was worth it to me. To the people upset I didn't call sooner, I hear you and I understand. I am mad at myself that I hadn't called sooner. I was too easily influenced by bosses and coworkers and believed them when they fed me reasons not to call. Believe me, it bothers me too. Story 5. Early childhood and primary school teacher, directly from experience. 1. A school with a uniform required all girls to wear dresses. However, one girl, Emma, refused to hem hers up. She wanted hers ankle length and could not be talked out of it no matter how much she was made fun of. 2. Same girl ran around in circles saying, "Cola makes me intoxicated," and acted as though she was passing out, a little performance to her peers. Her mother brought it to the teacher's attention because she never gave Emma cola. 3. She began puberty prior to 10 years old. 4. She would wake from nightmares and have these screaming headaches. 5. Came home with garments that wasn't hers. And 6. Lastly, she one day hit a man who was walking through the primary school. Turns out this man, the local priest of the Catholic primary school, was taking Emma out of class to do odd jobs. Teachers never questioned it at the time. She ended it all years later. Story 6. Regression. I'm a speech therapist who works with inner city elementary children where we see a lot of poverty. I had one case stand out to me in particular that stands out. I saw a little girl, 7 years old, who had been delayed on her language skills. We knew she had a very difficult upbringing since she was the product of a mistreatment. She lived only with her mother, who impressively kept the two events as separated as possible. The criminal, who I refused to call a father, had served time in jail but was released at this point on house arrest. He had no rights to see her. But the criminal's parents, technically the child's grandparents, went to court and demanded rights to see their granddaughter. They refused to ever believe their son was a criminal. Some judge, who I hope thinks of this case often, allowed it as long as father was not present. It started as supervised visits and eventually turned into visitation without supervision. Mom fought as hard as she could, but she couldn't afford a lawyer like the grandparents could. Mom had to drop her daughter off to the parents every other weekend for one night. I don't know how she did it. Anyways, I started to see a huge regression in her language skills. Her mean length of utterance decreased. She couldn't logically organize her thoughts into sentences. She couldn't categorize anymore and so forth. Academically, when I spoke to the teacher, she said the same thing. But it really came to a head when she started to regress in other non-school related skills. One day, she wet her pants in my classroom and she just lost it. She was crying. She destroyed my room. She was hitting and punching to the point where I had to restrain her from hurting herself. She just lost it. Finally, when she calmed down, I brought her down to the nurse, got her a change of pants. But this girl was not only potty trained since I'd known her, but she was known for being sweet, polite, and just slow to warm up. She was not a child to have outbursts like this. She wasn't sick, and I felt like I really needed to say something outside the school. Long story short, grandparents were sneaking over to father's house so that her father could see and help raise his daughter. My heart broke for the mom. I'll never forget her telling us about how she couldn't live with herself knowing the fact that the man who mistreated her also mistreated her daughter. Anyways, you can probably imagine all the hurt and heartbreak the mother felt. Story 7. State of hygiene. Are they washed, hairbrushed, clothes clean, and different from day to day? This has to somewhat be taken into context with the environment of the neighborhood, but even families who don't have many clothes will not want their children seen in dirty clothes at school. Kids don't like their hair brushed typically, but if it is continuously tangled, even matted, it would and has raised my interests. Marks in places that can't be explained, consistency in unexplained bruises or red marks. Many children who are mistreated will deal with it by showing inappropriate love and affection towards them or teachers who are in line with them, trying to always hug them, kiss them. But it has a different feel than the hugging most kids show. Just like it can feel different watching two adults hug if they are friends or partners, they also tend to play with concepts that they should know nothing about. Listen to what they say. I work with young children. They talk about everything if given the chance by a trusted adult and not pushed. Story 8. I had a terrible experience as a student who was mistreated at home, and at one point I had a black eye every month or so. Once I had to do PE in shorts and I had a huge black spot on my inner thighs which spread from almost to the knee. I always told people I fell from my bike, broke crying out of nowhere regularly. My grades were awful and I had to repeat one entire year. I was a teenager and actually asked for help from the school counselor who, after listening to me, said, "Since your younger sister is involved, we'd have to act and call the police. If you don't want to, we can just pretend we didn't have this talk." I was scared, so nothing actually happened. She left me with a bunch of propaganda pamphlets. She was into politics in my school town, asking me to give them to random people. Teachers kept on treating me like a rebellious teenager with behavioral problems, even though they made many talks about speaking up to the teacher if we had problems at home or we were being mistreated. This was in Milan, Italy, 5 to 10 years ago. Now I can usually recognize anyone who had been mistreated at home when they were kids in a short conversation. Story 9. My perspective is high school, grades 7 through 12. Difference in how they treat male and female teachers. I have had quite a few students who I can tell have had pretty toxic fathers because they project their issues onto me as a male teacher. Overly sensitive kids, no healthy environment produces a kid who's extremely emotionally unstable in high school. There will be a toxic or cruel environment somewhere in their life, pestering, home life, or otherwise. Off comments that slip out because the kid feels it's somewhat normal, but it's way off what's normal. Like, "Don't worry, sir, it's just that I got 8 hours of sleep last week." The content of the art that they doodle in the margins, how they deal with other kids, hyperaggression or power plays or red flags, how they deal with knowing they've got an answer wrong. Those who are from toxic environments can be very fearful of retribution for any imperfection from them, doing things just for the sake of being in control of that thing. I have a student who shaves their eyebrows off and another who will purposely be a few minutes late to every one of my classes. I caught them on time once by accident and they walked right out to come back in a few moments later, so they were late. Story 10. I had a high school student when I first began teaching. I knew her boyfriend was mistreating her. He was also a student at the school. Her best friend came to me and asked if I could intervene. I told her friend I couldn't unless I witnessed something or if her friend told me directly. One day, the girl being mistreated finally told me, but only after I saw the boy hurt her. I always kept an eye on them when I knew they'd be together in the hall. The school was a brand new charter school and had fewer than 300 students. I called the police and he was arrested. She then told me everything. 20 plus years later, I still receive cards from her, always thanking me for helping her and knowing what was happening. I also still hear from the girl who was the best friend, and every once in a while the topic comes up again. That's not necessarily one of the good parts of teaching, but I've always thought that if I could help a student in some positive way, it was all worth it. However, I'm not teaching any longer. Story 11. I work at a rural community college, and sometimes we get kids from quiverful type environments. They're either super responsible or completely non-functional, no in between. We also get street pharmacists and a lot of other adults who are looking for an escape. Some of the kids I see are illiterate. They can make out words and kind of write, but the number who simply need glasses to be able to read is way too high. Refusing to get a kid's eyes checked seemed to be a thing. The kid with poor eyesight doesn't get glasses, he just gets called stupid. Students with this kind of neglect either take on too much responsibility because they've been taught to be useful to others at the expense of themselves, or are avoidant of any kind of responsibility. With both, they neglect self-care. They've been taught that self-care is selfish. Someone who seems enthusiastic in the first 2 weeks and then drops off sharply has been taught to put themselves last. They absolutely will not ask for help. In my department, we ask them to come in and help us try out a new learning tactic or educational module. Avoidant students in general have untreated trauma or neglect. They wouldn't express it because they've never had anyone care before, and it's way too risky to ask for help only to get rejected. If someone is silent or absent when they shouldn't be, college mental health services should be consulted. They tend to get at the bigger picture. And for K through 12, if anyone overhears a student desperately trying to get anyone in class to accompany them home, it means their parents won't scream at them in front of the company. I had a friend just for that. We'd take turns going home with each other. On days I didn't have to work, we'd go to my place and study, even if it was just sitting in my room reading because it protected me for a couple of precious hours. I was not a social child otherwise and didn't even like to do our group work or play at recess, so me becoming desperately social only when it was time to go home should have been a red flag. Story 12. Sweetest teacher here in Sweden. My mom was the principal for almost 30 years at a school for kids aged 6 to 12, so she'd seen some bad things during her years. She didn't tell me everything because of non disclosure agreements on her part, but she did tell me some things. One such thing was a girl from Somalia. She and her parents went back to Somalia on vacation, and when they got back, the girl told one of the staffers that she had been cut with scissors down there. Now, it is quite common in Somalia and Eastern Africa and extremely illegal in Sweden. So the law forces you to call Child Protective Services if you even suspect something afoot. So the staffer did, and the CPS and police show up and place the girl in protective custody, and the parents are arrested and held in custody. The girl goes to a hospital and is examined, and it turns out the whole thing was a lie. The parents are furious and remove their kid from that school and threaten legal action. As far as I know, nothing came of it. To clarify, the parents weren't put in jail. They were being held by the police until their daughter had gone through a medical examination. Story 13. I'm not a teacher, but I can give you the answer from the mistreated child's perspective. Me and my siblings grew up in an extremely violent, cruel household, and we each reacted differently. We were also mistreated by a male family member. I was extremely sensitive and withdrawn as a child. At elementary school, I struggled to form friendships and kept myself to myself. I would often hide in the restroom during recess as I had a fear of interacting with others. I would cry a lot, especially if I made a mistake at school. I was labeled as shy, but in actual fact, I was just terrified of the world and traumatized. One of my sisters, on the other hand, was pegged as a problem child and a pester as she was aggressive to other children and struggled with authority. She had frequent angry outbursts at school and was unable to regulate her emotions. She would scream at other students and teachers and use inappropriate adult language. She started self-harming, which is when a teacher noticed and the relevant authorities were informed. Up until that point, no one had intervened, even though with hindsight, it was so clear something awful had been going on behind closed doors. One thing to note with physical cruelty is that they are often calculated and will hit a child in an area where bruises are not easily detectable and can be kept covered. Story 14. Not a teacher, but have worked a lot with mistreated, neglected kids. Mistreated kids may behave very inappropriately for their age. Potty-trained kids may soil their pants habitually or bedwetting for older kids. Acting out is common since they've learned they can use themselves to get attention. Lacking bruises or other marks, physical cruelty has more subtle tells. Always apologizing or unwarranted aggression, pestering, are learned ways of dealing with a threatening environment. Defensive behaviors may be reflexive, like flinching when offered a high five. Neglected kids might hoard food or other things that bring comfort and appear mature for their age. Emotional cruelty has lasting effects on a person's ability to relate. As others have said, kids will emulate their role models, and their language and attitudes toward others are telling. Acting like an absolute turd may be the kid's strategy for staying safe if their most formative relationships have led them to expect only mistreatment and abandonment. Story 15. Mistreatment. If a kid knows too much too young, knowing proper names should be normalized. Describing activities in vivid, accurate detail in first, second, third grade is a whole different issue. Connections I didn't make until I was older. I rather aggressively flirted and pursued a boy until I got him to kiss me at a skating rink. My mistreatment at home started sometime in first grade. In third grade, new school, new boy to aggressively flirt and pursue. Drew several graphic scenes, some were in school, never reported to home. In intimacy education, 5th to 6th grade, I knew the answer to everything, literally. I would ramble about things beyond the scope of class, and it was brushed off as, oh, not everyone's parents have talked to their kids like yours have. Let's keep things simple for the sake of the class. I've always had unhealthy relationships with older men. I would flirt hard with every male teacher beyond the usual middle school, high school girls having a harmless crush, an older male authority figure in general since early elementary. Fantasized about having intimacy with them, wrote in a diary about what I wanted to do with them. So, yeah, don't brush things off. If it feels wrong, look into it, ask a colleague or a school counselor for their thoughts, and help if you need to. I was terrified to ask for help because I'd been threatened about what would happen if I did. I didn't do the above things consciously as cries for help, but looking back, that's what they were, and not one person recognized or acted on the signs of something out of the ordinary. And if you're learning a thing or two from the video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 16. From the side of neglect as a kid, my mom never physically or mentally mistreated me for the most part, just straight up neglect. She would lock herself in her bedroom for most hours of the day, milking, Medicaid, food stamps, and I think SSI. There was food in the cupboards, but there was no love in the house. I had a hard time showing emotions and understanding what is a fun way of playing around and what is inappropriate. I lashed out in anger a lot, which took years to control. Then I swung the other way and became extremely shy when I wasn't being pestered in school. By 12, I had learned how to cook and clean after myself, had no friends who weren't in special ed, had no personality or drive, just the willpower to go to school to get away from home. Then I got an afternoon paper route to make some basic income for myself. My mom saw what I did and got like 5 routes of her own, but volunteered me to do them and she kept the money. Then she got a super early morning route when I got into ninth grade and forced that on me too. I was falling asleep in the first period and failed class. Whenever I would tell her no, I would be abandoned wherever I stood up to figure out my own way home. Eventually, I got an okay job for being a high schooler and gave up my route. My mom still volunteers me to do routes even if it make me late for work. Eventually, I stood up again but was denied rides to work. I trudged in Iowa blizzards to my job with subpar thin winter clothes. I had zero self-esteem by the time I graduated. My mom passed away last year. Her birthday is next month. I plan on posting a nasty therapy letter I wrote to and about her publicly, just so I can still feel like I control my own life. I doubt my story is helpful, but I hope it can lead to signs to others in my predicament. I can also try to answer questions when I wake back up. Story 17. Not a teacher, but a former mistreated kid who no one saw. I was really angry as a kid. I wouldn't hit or pester anyone. Actually, I was also pestered. I had problems concentrating in class. And once in second grade, my teacher took me outside to talk, and I told her how I was so angry at her, and so I want to throw something at them, at 7-year-old guys. Also, once, I didn't do my math homework in fourth grade, and the teacher said she'd have to call my mom and talk to her, and I started crying my soul out. I hate crying in front of people, and saying how she would end me, so the teacher finally broke and said she won't call my mom, but she also did nothing. If a kid is that afraid of their parents, believe them. I keep thinking, what if someone would have asked me? Just ask. Maybe I could have said something. Maybe I wouldn't have to go through all of it and end up where I did now. Maybe I could have somewhat of a normal life, but no one ever did, so I guess I'll never know. Story 18. Teacher here, just chiming in. Location matters a lot with this. While all this is good advice and as a teacher you should keep your eye out for, take note of your school and the area you teach in before making any judgments. For example, you're teaching in a rural part of Vietnam. Some kid hasn't done his homework and is asleep in your class. This is happening a lot. While this is normally a huge red flag in the West or built-up areas, there's a very high chance that he didn't do his homework and he's asleep in your class because last night and this morning before school, he was working on his family farm trying to help support his family. If he falls asleep, you let him sleep. He needs it. I now work in a highly held academic part of Tokyo and have some kids fall asleep in my class. I look into their home life and find they go to 2 or 3 different schools on top of ballet, swimming, piano, some sports, weekend classes, or juku. You let those little guys sleep a bit too. They really need it. So basically, if a kid's falling asleep in class, it's either poor kid or spoiled brat. Got it. Story 19. I had a kid in my former class, Bobby, who never smiled. I mean, literally, had never made a smile in front of me. I'd been his form teacher for at least a year by this point, and it occurred to me one day that I had no idea what his face looked like when he smiled. To be clear, he interacted frequently with others. He was in the popular crowd, smart and quick-tongued, but almost everything he said was negative or mocking someone or arguing. It was like his whole personality was based around being cruel. I asked a few of his teachers, does Bobby ever smile, laugh, or joke in your class? All of them responded with, now that you mention it, no. I watched him for a week or so, no smiling. At one point, I remember he mocked one of the other kids in the class while his friends laughed. Bobby just stared at the kid. Kinda creepy, to be honest. His dad came to one parents' evening. In 4 years as his tutor, I only met his dad like once. I remember Bobby's dad and another dad were both waiting to see me. I had less to say to the other kid's dad, so I let him go first to get him out of the way, to be honest. Bobby's dad kicked off at me for asking him to wait. I was suggesting waiting 2-3 minutes tops. I put my foot down, but Bobby's dad was not happy at all. And when I finally called him to my table, he stared at me throughout the whole interview. Quite scary, to be honest. I eventually spoke to my senior pastoral teacher about the lack of smiling, and she said she was going to look into his home life. Unfortunately, that's where it became a need to know situation, and I never found out if anything was actually amiss. Story 20. Mine is a bit reversed. My dad felt he could not properly take care of me, so he temporarily handed me off to my uncle until he could manage his mental health, money, etc. But my uncle instead mistreated me and harmed me regularly. I would go to school with my lips and nose busted, and my teacher would not only ignore it, but get me in trouble for the smallest things just so she could see me in trouble. Sorry, I just needed a vent somewhere. For reference, I am a black male, and this stuff happened during 2017 summer and up until late 2018. And of course, it took until 6th grade for the principal to notice, and finally sent CPS, who, mind you, would have left me with my uncle had my grandma not volunteered. Man, it feels good to vent about these things. My grandma tried to get a therapist, but after one session, they stopped contacting us. And boy, did I need it. I often show little to no emotion, and sometimes it scares me. And other times, I just blatantly don't trust people. The trust thing makes more sense looking back on it. But anyway, this is a long post. I just needed someone to listen. Thank you for reading. It means a lot. Story 21. Not a teacher, but was a neglected kid. Acting consistently mature or immature for their age. Ploys for attention from peers and adults. Acting obnoxiously weird, dressing goofy, telling other kids his forbidden knowledge. Dressing, acting overly, making inappropriate jokes earlier than expected, acting out towards peers. Obsession with relationships, being boy-girl crazy. In high school, lots of drama, jealousy, and insecurity around dating. Problems with attendance and homework that seem to be the fault of the parents, not the student. Missing signatures on permission slips, riding home consistently late. Difficulty completing projects that require parent support. Family trees, science fair projects, things that require special supplies or transportation outside school. Either avoiding being alone by constantly socializing or self-isolating from peers. Compulsive behavior around cell phone and internet use. I was so lonely in middle school that I quite literally spent my free time seeking out adult strangers on the internet because that kind of attention was better than none at all. I desperately wanted someone to pay attention to me, compliment me, and act enthusiastic about spending time with me. Internet people were more than happy to oblige. In 4th grade, I wrote a naughty limerick from 4chan on a Valentine for a classmate. I did it anonymously, but was too dumb to change my handwriting and was caught immediately when it upset the recipient to the point of tears. No one questioned why I was expressing such dark things. Instead, I was punished, almost expelled, and continued the cycle of seeking out people for myself online for several years. I really feel like if someone had stepped in at that point, a lot of my later suffering would have been prevented. I was never unwashed or hungry type neglected. My parents just worked so much that I was consistently left unsupervised. Story 22. Not a teacher. I was mistreated by my dad before and after my mother passed away. It wasn't even a secret. The teachers all knew. There was never enough proof to call the authorities, and school politics meant nobody wanted to be the one to call it out. I stayed until the library closed most days, almost volunteered for parent-teacher meetings, despite never having a parent show up for me. I went through a period of not feeling safe enough to sleep at home, so when I got to school, I passed out for a few hours. I was never woken up or shouted at. When my mother passed away, they expected me to stay home for a few weeks. I was back. The next day, nobody said anything. The night she passed away, I was supposed to perform with the school orchestra. I still went and played. My form tutor gave me the biggest hug. When she was off ill with a collapsed lung, I was inconsolable. I couldn't cope without her. I jumped at being called on, like visibly flinching. My weekly journal was never signed, but I didn't get punished. There were days I would turn up at lunchtime. It happened often. My dad had days off from work, and I would be his punching bag. The signs are always there. You just have to connect the dots and speak up, please. I promise you that it's better to say something and have it be a fluke than ignore the suffering really going on. Story 23. If you are really interested in learning this fully, look up the UK's school safeguarding training. Anyone who works in a school, even cleaners and cooks, must complete it, and it answers your question and more. In short, certain combinations of unusual behavior can indicate mistreating of varying types. The most common maltreatment is neglect, and it is also the hardest to spot as the signs are things like scruffy appearance, hunger, body odor, withdrawn mood, which are also signs of being a typical teenager, which is why it is important to know the kids you interact with so you can tell what is abnormal for that particular child. In the UK, those who work in schools and nurseries are obligated to report anything, however small, to a designated safeguarding lead. The report rarely in itself triggers an investigation and a phone call to home to police, but provides a small piece to an overall puzzle. If a kid had a hole in their shoe, then the next day had new shoes, then that's not neglect. But if they had the same shoes for weeks, scruffy clothes, and were constantly asking for more food, only a school chef would notice that pattern, then all of that brings a case for neglect. Story 24. I used to work for AmeriCorps as a full classroom support and tutor. There was one student who was considered unmanageable, mean, intimidating. I personally found him funny, and when given a chance, very kind. He originally wasn't in my small groups where we would work on academic and behavioral skills, but I specifically requested he was after overhearing him confront the teacher after giving him a poor grade, saying, "Are you actually trying to get me to pass away?" After a month or so of doing no work, simply getting to know him, aka me, sometimes sitting there for the full hour in silence, he finally broke silence and said to me, "Why do you care so much about me?" And I said, "Well, T, you're smart, and I want you to realize it." This kid could add and multiply decimals in his head in the 8th grade, yet had the most suspensions and infractions. No teacher gave him a solid chance because he had such a large personality. I could tell at home he was never given a voice. As one other Redditor mentioned, the kid was wearing long sleeves in hot weather, very telling. Hated being touched and redirected because he was always being told what to do at home. One day I saw him in the library alone at lunch playing chess by himself. So the next time we had our weekly meeting, I challenged him to chess and this kid just opened up. It was almost overwhelming how much this kid would talk. This kid was living with his nana while his mom and dad served time in federal prison. His dad used to use him to sell substances. His nana roughened him up for poor grades, but he could care less about school because his teachers don't see his value. We worked out a system where we would play chess whenever he felt like he needed to refocus. He was getting good grades, and he even got onto the basketball team after being released from academic probation. Unfortunately, one day he just stopped coming to school. As far as I know, his mom was released and he went to live with her in Indiana. I think about that kid a lot and hope he's using all the tools and strategies we worked on. Story 25. A once gregarious kindergarten stopped smiling and playing. I'd taught several of her brothers, and she was the only daughter. I'd called CPS on the family over the years because the boys hadn't been cared for properly with impacted wax in their ears. Their home was filthy and they were unkempt. But this little girl was a joy and then a zombie. We learned that her brother, who had been sent out of state, had returned and was, well, he immediately confessed, went to jail. During parent-teacher conferences, the father and the other older adult brothers came to my room and threatened me. They also went to the teachers of the younger sons. The adults were banned from school, and eventually the estranged mother got her children back from the evil father. It was a horribly painful experience for all. The father had mistreated the mother years before and kicked her out of the home. Last time I saw the girl, she was happy and excited to see me. She had spent a few years angry at me for ruining her family. Story 26. OMG, the flashbacks. Okay, teachers, as a former student in an abusive environment, let me advise you. Do not just randomly chat up the supposed opposer about your suspicions and then disappear. I will never understand the teachers who guessed my siblings and I were being mistreated. I thought to ask our parents if we were being mistreated then. Took no further action. If you're trying to save a kid, then save a kid. Asking an opposer if they mistreat? Literally, what do you think happened to us when they got home? What fairy tale are you living in? Do you think they magically stopped hurting us just because you let them know you had suspicions were being harmed? No. You get your back beat down for showing signs you're getting your back beat down. I vividly remember the non-stop interrogation after a parent-teacher conference when it was asked what goes on in our home because I looked terrified, her exact words, every time I didn't get an A. Really? You asked that knowing we're going home in 30 minutes? So stupid. CPS even came to our house once after the parent hurt my sister in front of everyone at school. They were told to take the kids then if you don't like it. And then CPS literally never came back? What the heck? Just shut up if you're not going to actually do something about it. A half effort to save a mistreated victim results in full retaliation. Story 27. I'm not a teacher, but instead a 17-year-old who is only just realizing how bad my home life actually is. Not realizing from this question, but actually seeing a therapist and talking it out. First, hoarding things and food. This can be a sign of controlling diet from parents or just the feeling of never owning your own things. I was put on a strict diet at 10 and often hoarded food. I also ended up hoarding toys because I have 4 siblings and we often had to share so many things. I never felt like I had my own stuff. 2, extremely quiet or extremely oversharing. Everyone knows that a kid who never talks can have something that is going on, but everyone forgets its counterpart, oversharing. This includes stuff like English essays or just on a day to day basis. I'm an oversharer, which I think is pretty obvious from my comment. I think it's due to a desire to be listened to. I don't remember ever being listened to before from my family, so my friends often got the short end of the stick because of that. 3, a fear of asking for things. That kind of goes along with anxiety, but for the longest time, I remember fearing to ask for things. This includes medical help, school help, and just advice in general. A prime example of this for me is when I first started having asthma symptoms. I ignored them for like a month before actually telling my parents about them because I had a fear of asking for the help I needed. That is not normal. 4, overly caring towards others. I thought it was just me being motherly, but I found myself to be near constantly worried about others, so I'm overly kind towards my friends. I'm not sure exactly why I'm so worried or so fearful or anything, but I'm blatantly ignoring my own needs and health for others. It may seem kind and caring to others, but it's not to you. I've dealt with neglect and parents who are blatantly unaware of how much damage they have been doing because to them, cruelty is physical. Emotional/mental cruelty can only be done by sociopaths or psychopaths, and religious cruelty is only from a cult. But by definition, every religion is a cult, but I digress. These are only a few things that I can think of off the top of my head, but there's so much more. Story 28. Not a teacher, but I was in 6th grade at a very wealthy art school in Florida. My mom had just divorced my dad, and she was raising 3 kids, so money was pretty scarce outside of food and basic necessities. Nothing disgustingly terrible, but there were nights when I did my homework in the sunlight. One day, our English teacher gave us an assignment to write about Thanksgiving and family dinners and what you like about them. I didn't write anything because I didn't really have Thanksgiving dinners. My entire family lived in New York City except us, really, or dinner with my own mom. She worked 2 jobs day and night, so I would come home, wake her up around 6 p.m., and we'd cook ourselves or she'd cook for us, but we rarely ate together. My teacher took note of this. I always wrote vividly so she knew something was off, and collected $350 from a group of teachers and just gave me a Thanksgiving gift card to Costco. I simply said thank you, meekly, went home super happy and showed my mom. She was like, whoa. And that weekend, we bought a bunch of food from Costco. She took the day off and we all ate a proper family Thanksgiving dinner. The next day, I went to my school and my teacher asked me how was my Thanksgiving. It was only at that point that I thought about what she did without making a scene about it. It made me cry. I just cried in her room, all smiling and stupid. She thought something bad happened and started to apologize, but I explained that it was great. I don't even remember her name, but I will always remember that act of kindness. Story 29. Not me, but my mom. She's been a middle school teacher for like 30 years or so, and she rarely talks about her students at home. But I remember this one specific student she was shaken by. She talked about him really tenderly, even though he always had bad grades. He was really quiet and almost always got picked on by the bigger and more popular kids. Most people made fun of him when he had to read out loud in class because he talked funny and was extremely shy. One day, a girl was crying in recess and mom was walking by, about to reopen the classroom, because something happened at her house and this boy walked up to her and straight up said, "Hey, I know you hate me, but is everything okay?" The girl replied that she was going to be fine, but that she didn't hate him or anything. Then he just chuckled a little bit and said, "It's okay, you don't have to pretend, even my parents hate me. I just want to see if you're okay because you're always with your friends, but you're here alone, like me. I hate being alone when I'm sad, but if you need to talk, I'll be around." Mom contacted the school counseling, it works kind of differently here in Brazil, and asked to talk to the kids' parents and whatnot. Turns out his parents were having a divorce and they were both taking it out on him. Kid was left alone at home most of the time, and they acted either aloof or aggressive to him at home. His dad heard him silly and things like that. I don't know what happened after the school found out about this, but whenever I think about this, I can't imagine how many kids like that mom had to deal with. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.